Pardon me?
Oh, I was just thinking, like, for a group of our size, there's a lot of logistics.
So many.
So many things you have to have sorted out.
Yeah. Praise to Jorge. So we're here in Argentina, Patagonia, and we're going to talk a bit about science. So this is the nervous system. And we have a central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Peripheral, which is the rest, contains somatic and autonomic nervous system. Somatic is touch or feeling, you know, like when somebody's touching you, and also like, hey, these are nice glasses. I move to grab your glasses and put them in my pocket. Then there's the autonomic nervous system, which is everything that happens inside our body. Blood vessels contracting, heartbeat, temperature control, hormonal release, inflammation response, breath also, of course. Breath is both autonomic and somatic. We talked about that, so we're not going to do that again. Now, if we look at the autonomic nervous system, there's the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Fight or flight, sympathetic, parasympathetic, rest and digest. And the parasympathetic is where our calmness is, and the sympathetic is where our stress is, and it makes it sound like the sympathetic is bad and the parasympathetic is good. And that's something I want to take away, basically. So the sympathetic is high adrenaline. Heartbeat goes up, temperature goes up. Your lungs take up more oxygen. What more? Heartbeat goes up, blood vessels contract. This is why your blood pressure goes up, like all those things. Of course, too long is unhealthy. But let's stick to adrenaline. Yeah, adrenaline up is heartbeat up, basically. Without adrenaline, we wouldn't wake up from the night. We wouldn't be alive. So adrenaline is not a bad thing. The adrenaline junkies here are like, no way, it's a good thing. You know, like, let's jump out of a plane. So it's true that the stress is in the sympathetic nervous system, in the fight or flight, but this is also where our energy is. And if you look at the parasympathetic, this is where our calmness is, but also our passive behavior, you know, some days nothing comes out of your hands. We have so many ideas, but we just seem not to get it done, you know what I mean? This is being too parasympathetic, basically a lack of adrenaline. So parasympathetic is low adrenaline, blood vessels widen, heartbeat goes down, blood pressure goes down, stuff like that. Now, the paradox kind of is that if we activate that sympathetic at free will, and we do this by sports, but we do this also by deep breathing techniques and also by cold training, but if you activate it at free will, you get to be more parasympathetic afterwards. Like somebody that is running or has a running practice, the act of running makes your heartbeat go up to, say, 120, 140, which is, you know, if you have a continuous heartbeat of 120, you're not going to get older than 40 years old, you know, it's very unhealthy. But by having that temporal high heartbeat and activating the sympathetic, somebody that has a running practice has a lower heartbeat than somebody that doesn't. So that is like the analogy. So activating the sympathetic is actually a very good thing, and it makes you calmer afterwards. And you have noticed that because if you do your breathing exercises, what happens when we do deep breathing, breath hold exercises, deep breathing is activating the sympathetic. Yeah, so your heartbeat goes up, you know, your blood vessels contract, blood pressure goes up. This is why somebody with an extreme high blood pressure shouldn't just get into Wim Hof method or DMT breathing, you know, because it can be a little bit too much. And then what happens in the breath hold? Like there's breath hold on the breath in and breath hold on the breath out. If you hold your breath on the breath out, Wim Hof method, you fall from your sympathetic in your parasympathetic. Heartbeat goes down. Yeah, so if your heartbeat is 60, you start breathing, it goes up to 100. And then when you breathe out and hold, it goes within 30 seconds. You can test this with yourself by just putting your fingers on your wrist when you do your breathwork exercises. It goes down to 50, maybe even 45. And after a few rounds of breathing, we are extremely parasympathetic. You know, your heartbeat sometimes even goes below your resting heartbeat at night, your lowest possible heartbeat. So this is super cool, right? Any questions about this? Okay, so let's look at the benefits of breathing exercises. More oxygen in the muscles, alkalize your body, inflammation down, more red blood cells, train your cardiovascular system, neurotransmitters as like dopamine, but also very likely DMT, serotonin, and a calm breath in daily life. Let me go one by one, get to them. You know, what happens if we do the deep breathing? Let me show you another graph. This one. These are the 3 phases of TT breathing or Wim Hof method breathing. Like a normally healthy person has an oxygen saturation of say 98%. So when we do our deep breathing, we add only 2% of oxygen. But what does happen is we blow out a lot of CO2. So this is the phase 1, this part. Yeah, this should be steeper. Then what happens in the breath hold, CO2, you know, our cells keep on producing energy and therefore CO2 and keep on using oxygen. Now the oxygen level stays like pretty long on 100%, but the CO2 level slowly goes up. But because you've blown out so much CO2, it takes a long time for that CO2 to get back to that normal level. And that normal level, the breathing trigger, the feeling of I really need to breathe in now is because of too much CO2 and not because of a lack of oxygen. So in the end of our breath hold, our oxygen level drops way below the danger zone of 90. And is that dangerous? No, because it's temporal. If you have like continuous below 90, you should be in the hospital with an oxygen mask on. But because it's temporal, it's maybe 10, 20, 30 seconds or something like that. It's actually very healthy. So a few things are happening. And then in the recovery breath, it kind of goes back to normal recovery, right? So there's a few things happening. First of all, by holding our breath so long, we get like a lack of oxygen, not only in the blood, this is about the blood, but also in your muscle tissue. And if there's a temporal lack of oxygen, chronically of course you're gonna die, but temporal, your cells are getting stressed, much like sports. Like, hey, wait a minute, there's something going on, and they start to become more efficient. And then you take that last breath and hold it on the breath in, and this is where there's suddenly oxygen again, and they take up more oxygen. So after 45 minutes of breathing, you should have about twice as much oxygen in your muscle tissue. And this is why if you do like 8 rounds of Wim Hof method or 45 minutes of breathing, you can run like a Forrest Gump afterwards, you know? So this is how we eventually, by temporarily depriving ourselves from oxygen, eventually we get more oxygen in the muscle tissue. It's cool, right? Any questions of our?
So you just said that for Wim Hof, like 30 breaths. Is this the same for TT10? Is it the same thing? How is it different when you're just doing 10 breaths and holding it on the way in as opposed to Wim Hof?
So what is different from say TT30 and Wim Hof method, because that looks very much alike.
Okay.
Is first we hold on the breath in.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you look at the sympathetic, breathing deeper is activating the sympathetic, and then Wim Hof method, breathe out and hold, you like fall into your parasympathetic.
Mm-hmm.
But by holding on the breath in, you get that extra spike of adrenaline.
Mm-hmm.
So you go even higher in your sympathetic nervous system
mm-hmm.
on that breath hold on the breath in, and then afterwards you breathe out and you hold your breath also. So this is about dopamine and adrenaline. Like adrenaline is made from dopamine. They transfer into each other.
Mm-hmm.
So when we do deeper breathing, we make a lot of adrenaline. So basically, your adrenaline spikes up, your dopamine goes down. your body recognizes that and starts producing dopamine like a madman, because suddenly there's not enough dopamine. More adrenaline, more adrenaline, more adrenaline. And then you breathe out, adrenaline goes down, and your dopamine levels go up because the adrenaline is transferred back into dopamine. You know, I still haven't checked this with doctors. I'm not sure if this is really true, but this is what I assume is happening. Okay, let me be very straight with this. But no doctor could ever, you know, I spoke to a few doctors in Brazil, and they said there's no transfer between dopamine and adrenaline, and that is just not true, because there is. Adrenaline is made from dopamine. And the other way around, I'm assuming that's happening as well. But because you have such a spike in adrenaline, you start making dopamine, and then the danger is over, you hold your breath, and your dopamine levels are higher than normal afterwards.
Is that the sense of euphoria?
Yes, together with adrenaline.
Mm-hmm.
According to Andrew Huberman, who I think is an amazing guy, the combination of adrenaline and dopamine is that state of flow. Like, I have energy and I'm good to go, and you know, you can, that's what you have on your hikes in Alaska. At a certain moment, you know, you get into the flow, this is where the dopamine is released and you have enough adrenaline, and that combination is the biochemistry of flow state, basically. So if we hold on the breath...
You know how they say sometimes, I'm sorry,
No, it's all right.
but sometimes they say a player is in the zone. Have you ever heard
Yeah.
that? Do you think that
is exactly the same. That's exactly the same. You know, you're producing adrenaline because you're like running, and you see the finish line, and there is this dopamine shot, and then you pop up. That's the flow state, the zone, the flow state. That's exactly the same.
Thank you.
So what happens when we hold on the breath in? We have like extra adrenaline spike. So theoretically, TT should make more dopamine, because you're just getting a little bit longer and higher in your adrenaline state. After a peak in adrenaline, dopamine is released. And this is how it works, how I assume it works. So we talked about how more oxygen gets into the muscle tissue. The alkalizing effect, it's very simple. CO2 makes your body more acidic, your blood, let's talk about our blood, but the same for the muscle tissue, and oxygen more alkaline. Now it's very temptative, is that an English word?
Tempting.
Tempting, thank you. It's very tempting to think like, oh my God, this is good stuff, because alkalizing your body is good. So I'm going to breathe deep the whole day. And before you know it, you're walking around like hyperventilating, thinking you do great. Everywhere where you are. Nobody wants to be your friend anymore because it's so bloody noisy. You know, oh, there we have the guy again who does the breathing techniques. You know, this is also why in public spaces you want to keep your voice down. Keep it your secret. Breathe as nobody hears you, because then nobody will disturb you. And I've had a friend of mine who was always and I was sitting next to him in the bus, and I was like, dude, do you have to do that? Yes, I have to do that. And I was just like, oh my God, you know, this is such a lesson, you know, that I will from now on be silent with my breathing techniques. So it's very tempting to think like, oh, wait a minute, alkalizing is good. But we have an extra thing in here, which is called the Bohr effect. If you're always breathing deep, then your CO2 level gets too low. And this is a very interesting thing within our muscle tissue, and this is the basics of the oxygen advantage and of Breathwork technique, that we should keep our CO2 levels high, because if they are too low, then there's an oxygen lock. So if that threshold of CO2 is reached, the oxygen doesn't get from the red blood cells into the muscle tissue anymore. So if you're always hyperventilating, long term, you get like a shortage of oxygen in your muscle tissue, and long term this is creating a lot of ugliness. You know, I can only imagine. But probably a lot of, you know, hyperventilation after, say, 10 years, probably somebody will be in autoimmune illnesses, you know, like an old man, although he's 35 years old, you know. So there's a bandwidth. If you have too much CO2 because you ran a marathon yesterday, you know, and you went into producing lactic acid, it's basically you have a lot of CO2 and a lack of oxygen. then it's too high, and you can get that CO2 down by doing a good deep breathing breath hold session. But if you're always breathing deep and your CO2 is under that Bohr effect threshold, then you are depriving your cells from oxygen. Yeah, so there's a bandwidth. Nothing is completely always true. I get like comments on my YouTube videos, deep breathing is bad, and it's like, no, it's not. It's just continuous deep breathing is bad. You know, I had a doctor in my course in Brazil who was like standing up when I was explaining about the sympathetic, parasympathetic, and that during deep breathing we activate the sympathetic. That's wrong, because we are stressed already enough. And I'm like, so are you saying then that running is also wrong because that gets your heartbeat up? And he became really silent. He was a very famous, you know, like Instagram doctor with a few 100,000 followers. And afterwards he came to me and he said like, seriously, I really didn't think I was going to learn anything about science here, but you're right, you know, by temporarily activating the sympathetic or like having a low state of CO2 is very healthy, and chronically is unhealthy. Like temporal inflammation because of sports is a very healthy thing, and chronic inflammation is a very unhealthy thing. So the difference is not like CO2 is bad or good. It's like chronically or temporally. That's what it's about. And this is why nothing is always true, basically. Makes sense? No? Yes? I hope. Right. So we talked about, let me get back to that list. Alkalis in our body. So very simply said, 7 is pH neutral. Our blood is 7.4. If you do 3 rounds of breathing, it goes up to 7.5. And so if you would do 4, 5, 8 rounds of breathing, I understand maximum to 7.8. And it takes between 1 to 5 hours to get back to 7.4. So say you do intense 1 hour of breathing before your marathon, basically you have an extreme low level of CO2, high level of oxygen. So the production of CO2 can keep on going. You can burn more calories and produce more energy until that level of CO2 is so high where you're panting and you need to stop running because you have too much CO2 and you're standing like breathing like that. Inflammation done. I'm not sure how it works, but I have a very simple way of explaining this to myself. If you are sick and suddenly you're like the 2 guys in the jungle and the tiger stands in front of you, you know, like you get a rush of adrenaline because you need to survive. At that moment, you know, your survival mechanism is just more important than that getting better, you know, because you have a fever. So your fever immediately goes to 0. And I've tested this on myself. I never really have a fever, but like the last 10 years, 2 times or something, you do some intense breathing and it goes down immediately. So high adrenaline is getting inflammation down. Now it's tempting to think like, okay, so adrenaline is good. You know, I always want to be high adrenaline, but that's not going to work for sure. You know, like high heartbeat and stuff like that. So it is a tool to get your inflammation or even your fever down. And if you have like an inflammation, autoimmune illness, you know, you can use that to suppress your inflammation because this inflammation is like not doing anything. It's basically attacking your own cells, you know, there's something wrong in your autonomic nervous system. So you can use it then to get your inflammation down. What I believe is that it balances out, you know, so the next thing I want to talk about is more red blood cells. There's an autoimmune illness where you have too much red blood cells. And your blood gets too thick and you can die from it, basically. I asked Wim, like, what about that? You know, like, yes, it's good to make more red blood cells, but can it be too much? And he says no, and of course Wim doesn't know everything either, but it just optimizes your red blood cells. So how does that work, red blood cell production? Back to this graph. Here in that red zone, that's basically where your oxygen saturation goes below 90, the danger zone. Yeah, if you're chronically at 90 or lower, you really have to be in the hospital. But temporarily it goes down to, I've seen 37. Most oxygen meters stop at 50 because that's impossible. You know, like somebody that has 50 is not alive, so they could just go blank. You need to buy a more expensive one, basically. What happens then is that suddenly you have this extreme shortage of oxygen in your blood. And your kidneys recognize this and they start to produce the hormone EPO. And EPO goes to your red bone marrow and is responsible for producing red blood cells. So it's like high altitude training without going into the mountains. And it takes 10 to 2 weeks to make red blood cells. So basically, you know, like you get immediate energy because you have more oxygen in your muscle tissue, but that's temporarily. But the production of red blood cells makes your sports performance like structurally become better. Then there's the training of the cardiovascular system. Very simply said, breathing deeper, activating the sympathetic, blood vessels go down. This is why your blood vessels contract, and this is why your blood pressure goes up. Very simply, your body needs more oxygen because whether you're running or a dangerous situation, you need more oxygen. And then when you breathe out and you hold, then when you breathe out and you hold, the opposite happens, your blood vessels dilate, you become more parasympathetic. So with the breathing, also with cold training, of course, but with breathing, you can train your cardiovascular system. And the more those muscles around your blood vessels are trained, the healthier your cardiovascular system is. And this is, you know, like the most common way of dying at this moment, whether it's heart issues, a blood vessel popping, or whatever. Dopamine, I already explained that. Then we have serotonin. 90% of our serotonin is made in the belly, in the gut. So if you go from being a chest breather to belly breathing, there will be more blood flowing there, it will be more optimal gut health, also more serotonin. Really simple. And then there's the question of DMT. You know, like science hasn't proven yet if it's produced in the pineal gland as far as I know, you know, maybe I'm not up to date, in every breath we take, in the lungs or in the gut. I believe personally it's produced everywhere. And this is where we see colors and we're like, you know, like you're tripping basically during breathing, especially when you squeeze your lower muscles and press the blood to your brain, you also squeeze the spinal fluids up. And this is proven, in the spinal fluids is as much DMT as serotonin and as dopamine. So we're filled with it, and to press it to the brain gives this trippy feeling. For me personally, like producing enough DMT gives you a feeling of being okay with life, like trusting life and being more intuitive. And some people call it God, you know, if you want to do that, that's fine. And then, you know, like these are all like benefits, health benefits and happy hormone benefits. But I think the biggest benefits is that after breathing, whether it's 5 rounds of Simplified Tummo or 2 rounds or 4 rounds of Tibetan or 4 rounds of Wim Hof method or 4 rounds of intense DMT breathing, afterwards you're able to really slow down your breath. And back to that Bohr effect, you do your deep breathing exercises, but then through the day you become like a light breather where you don't need to breathe so much. And keep your CO2 levels high enough so theoretically you could be in perfect health. And the thing that, you know, like the idea that, I have to walk away from stress, no, you have to voluntarily activate your sympathetic nervous system. And with that, afterwards you're calmer. And you can do this through sports, through breathing, and also through cold training. So the sympathetic is not bad, you just don't want to be ruled. It's like our rational brain is not bad, but you don't want to be ruled by it, you know? And with these breathing techniques, like if you do a few rounds of breathing, basically you reset your sympathetic, parasympathetic balance. So if you're really stressed, it will calm you down. But if you're really sleepy in the morning, it will wake you up. That's my pitch. Science of breathing. Any questions? Or on YouTube? Please let me know.